two friends, two legends, and one battle that would tear Rome apart. The story of Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great is not just about war. It's about friendship turned into rivalry, ambition turned into destiny, and a republic that was too great to survive its own greatness. In the twilight years of the Roman Republic, power was everything, and power was slipping away. The Senate no longer served the people. It served itself. Corruption festered in the marble halls of Rome, and beneath the golden statues of the gods, fear whispered like a cold wind. The Republic had become a stage where old men clung to privilege, while young men like Caesar dreamed of something greater, a Rome reborn, reshaped by his will. Julius Caesar was not born into wealth, but into hunger. He was a soldier of words and wars, a man who could charm the people and command the legions with equal mastery. He believed in the Republic, or perhaps in what it could have been. Yet ambition, once lit, burns brighter than any ideal. For Caesar, every victory in Gaul, every speech in the Forum, every cheer from the crowd fed that fire inside him, the fire to rule, to reform, to leave a legacy carved into eternity. Pompey Magnus, on the other hand, was the golden son of Rome. The people called him Magnus the Great, long before he ever set foot on a battlefield. He was everything. A Roman noble dreamed to be disciplined, heroic, loyal to the Senate. He had marched across continents, crushed pirates, and expanded Rome's borders further than any before him. But for all his triumphs, Pompey was haunted by something he could never control: time. New heroes rise, old legends fade, and in Caesar's shadow, Pompey began to feel the chill of being replaced. Once they stood side by side, brothers in arms united in power. Along with Crassus, they formed the First Triumvirate, the alliance that ruled the Roman world. They laughed together, dined together, and divided the empire like gods shaping continents. But when Crassus fell in the east, their triangle of power broke, and two giants were left standing, staring at each other across the ruins of their friendship. The Senate saw its chance. They courted Pompey, praising his loyalty, feeding his pride, whispering in his ear, "Caesar has grown too strong. He will end the Republic." And slowly the seed of doubt took root. The man Pompey once called a friend now looked like a rival too dangerous to ignore. Far to the north, Caesar stood in Gaul, surrounded by loyal legions who had followed him through blood and winter. He received word that the Senate, at Pompey's urging, had ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome alone. He read the decree in silence. Around him, the campfire crackled under the cold January sky. His officers waited uneasy. Caesar's face was calm, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, burned with quiet fury. He knew the moment had come. To obey would mean humiliation, perhaps even death. To defy would mean civil war. That night the air was thick with mist as Caesar approached the narrow bridge over the river Rubicon, the invisible line that separated his command from treason. The river shimmered faintly under the torchlight. The sound of water against the rocks was like the heartbeat of fate itself. Behind him, his men waited in silence. They trusted him, they feared him. And in that stillness, Caesar spoke the words that would echo through history. The die is cast. He spurred his horse forward. The hooves splashed into the cold current, and with that single step, Caesar crossed not just a river, but the boundary between law and legend, between loyalty and ambition. The men followed without hesitation, torches reflecting off their armor, their shadows stretching long into the night. They knew there was no going back. Rome would never be the same. And far away in the marble halls of the Senate, Pompey stood beneath the statues of old generals, listening to the messengers' frantic reports. His heart was heavy, not with fear, but with something deeper. He had once called this man a brother. Now he would have to destroy him. "Then so be it," he whispered, turning to his officers. "If Caesar comes to Rome with war, I shall meet him with war." Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. The Republic held its breath. And with that single step, Rome's fate was sealed. The river had been crossed, but the story of how Rome's greatest allies became its fiercest enemies began long before that night. Years earlier, when ambition still looked like friendship, three men stood at the height of their power: Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Crassus. Together they formed what history would call the First Triumvirate, an alliance built not on trust but on necessity. Caesar brought charisma and the loyalty of the people. Pompey brought prestige and the legions of the East. Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, brought gold, the lifeblood of politics. They were three pillars holding up a single empire united by one purpose: to control Rome from behind the marble masks of the Senate. For a time it worked. The Republic was stable, or at least appeared to be. Caesar gained command in Gaul. Pompey ruled the East, and Crassus sought glory in Parthia. Each man expanded his corner of the world, and with every victory their shadows grew longer. But power shared among equals rarely stays equal for long. Crassus's ambition led him to disaster. At Carrhae, his army was destroyed, his body lost in the desert sands. The Triumvirate became two, and with that balance gave way to rivalry. Pompey returned to Rome, greeted by the Senate as a savior, a man of virtue who could protect them from Caesar's rising influence. They praised him in public, flattered him in private, and fed his pride like a lion being tamed with meat. They whispered, "Caesar is not your friend. He is your replacement." And Pompey listened. Meanwhile, far to the north, Caesar's name thundered across Europe. From the forests of Gaul to the shores of the Atlantic, tribes fell before his legions. His dispatches from the battlefield, written with the precision of a general and the poetry of a statesman, spread through Rome like wildfire. The people adored him. The soldiers worshipped him. But the Senate feared him. To them, Caesar was no longer a loyal consul. He was a threat in armor, a man too loved, too powerful, too dangerous to be controlled. Alone in his tent after each victory, Caesar would stare into the flame of his oil lamp, knowing that every triumph pushed him further from the Rome he swore to serve. He could feel it, the distance growing between him and Pompey, between ambition and friendship. In letters that never reached their destination, he wrote words of longing and warning. Power divides men more than hatred ever could. Pompey, for his part, wrestled with his own conscience. He had once admired Caesar's brilliance, envied his courage, perhaps even loved him like a brother. But the Senate had woven its web too tightly. To stand by Caesar now would mean betraying the Republic, or so they told him. So he stood apart. And as Caesar's victories multiplied, Pompey's fear hardened into resolve. One gray morning in Rome, the Senate gathered beneath its marble dome. The air was thick with tension and incense. A decree was read aloud. Julius Caesar must disband his army and return to Rome at once as a private citizen. Every man in that chamber knew what it meant. If Caesar returned without his legions, he would be stripped of power and likely his life. Later that night, Pompey sat alone in his villa, the decree open on his desk. The wax seal of the Senate gleamed in the lamplight. A storm was building outside. The windows rattled with wind. He looked down at the parchment, then toward the statue of Jupiter towering in the corner. His voice, heavy and low, broke the silence. "May the gods forgive me, but this must be done." He signed the decree. Far to the north, in the camp at Ravenna, Caesar's messenger arrived, exhausted, mud-soaked, trembling with fear. Caesar broke the seal, read the order, and said nothing. The crackle of the fire filled the silence. Then he stood, his cloak swaying in the wind, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the tent. "Rome has made her choice," he said quietly. "Now I must make mine." Outside, his legions waited, sensing something monumental in the air. The rain began to fall steady and cold. Caesar mounted his horse, the torchlight glinting off his armor. He rode toward the river Rubicon, the invisible line that no Roman general was ever meant to cross. As he approached the bridge, thunder rolled across the valley. He paused only once, looking back at his men. In that heartbeat of silence, past and future met. The friend he once loved now stood on the other side, an enemy, a mirror, a memory. Then, with a single gesture, Caesar drew his sword forward and whispered, "We cross now, not for power, but for Rome." The river surged beneath him, dark and relentless. The hooves splashed into the current, and one by one the soldiers followed. Behind them, the world of the Republic began to fade like a memory in the rain. When the river's current carried Caesar forward, there was no way back for him or for Rome. The river had been crossed, and Rome trembled. Word of Caesar's advance spread faster than his legions could march. Panic rippled through the capital, senators fled with their families, slaves packed the villas, and the marble streets echoed with the sound of wagons rolling toward the sea. Pompey, the hero of Rome, retreated to the east. To the Senate, it was a tactical withdrawal. To the people, it looked like flight. Yet Pompey told himself he was saving the Republic, preserving it from the destruction Caesar would bring. But deep inside, he knew the truth. The Republic was already burning and he was running from the fire. Caesar entered Rome with no bloodshed. The gates were open. No soldiers opposed him. The Senate chambers stood silent. The same men who once roared accusations now vanished like ghosts. As Caesar rode through the empty forum, the hooves of his horse echoed against stone columns that had witnessed centuries of triumphs. Yet this victory tasted hollow. The city he loved, the heart of Rome, felt lifeless. Power was his, but without Pompey, without opposition, it felt like conquering a graveyard. Standing atop the steps of the Curia, Caesar gazed across the deserted square. His officers waited for orders, but he only whispered to himself, "This is not how Rome should be won." He knew what came next would decide not just the fate of his army, but the soul of Rome itself. Pompey regrouped across the sea, gathering forces in Greece. He commanded legions, loyal to the Senate, joined by nobles, old generals, and the sons of aristocrats, men who saw themselves as defenders of the ancient republic. They saw Caesar not as a reformer, but as a tyrant cloaked in glory. Each letter Pompey sent to his allies ended with the same promise: we fight not for power, but for Rome. Caesar ever, the strategist, refused to be rushed into battle. He secured Italy, then Spain, then crossed into Greece in pursuit of his old friend turned foe. The campaign was grueling. Storms, hunger, and exhaustion followed his men across the sea. But Caesar's soldiers were bound to him by something stronger than loyalty belief. They would march through hell if he led the way. One night, as the legions camped on the plains of Thessaly, Caesar walked among his men. The fires flickered in the wind, casting long shadows on the ground. He paused beside a young soldier cleaning his armor who looked up nervously. The boy asked General, "Do you think they hate us?" Caesar smiled faintly. "They are Romans, just like us. They fight for their Rome, we fight for ours." Then he added quietly, "If we must fight our own countrymen, then fight to end it quickly." Meanwhile, Pompey stood across the plain, surveying his vast army nearly double the size of Caesar's. Behind him, senators whispered words of confidence. "He has no chance. The gods favor us." Pompey said nothing. He looked out at the horizon where a thin mist clung to the grass. He could almost see Caesar's campfires burning through the fog, small defiant lights refusing to die. For the first time in years, Pompey felt something he hadn't felt in battle before: doubt. At dawn, the sky was cold and pale. The plains of Pharsalus stretched endlessly, a silent stage for destiny. Caesar's troops formed their lines, their breaths misting in the morning air. Shields glinted under the weak Sunday, trumpets blared. Across the field, Pompey's legions, 40,000 strong, moved like a single machine, banners fluttering in the wind. Between them lay the heart of Rome, invisible, divided, waiting. Caesar rode to the front, his crimson cloak whipping in the wind. He raised his hand and silence fell. His voice carried through the ranks, calm, steady, commanding. "My friends," he began, "today we fight not for riches nor revenge. We fight for the right to choose the Rome we believe in, and if we must fight our own countrymen, then fight to end it quickly and mercifully." His words settled over them like a prayer before the storm. Pompey on the opposite side mounted his white horse. He glanced toward the sky, then whispered to his aide, "It will be decided today." The aide nodded. "The Republic depends on it." Pompey's reply came like a sigh. "No, the Republic is already gone. Today, only Rome remains." The drums began to beat, slow, relentless. The distance between the two armies closed with every step. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath thousands of marching feet, as if the gods were watching in silence. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, two men, once bound by friendship, now divided by fate, stared across that field, knowing one of them would not see another dawn. Across that field, two visions of Rome were about to collide. The morning mist of Thessaly had barely lifted when the world began to shake. A single trumpet cried out, sharp, metallic, and unrelenting. Then came the answering roar of thousands. Shields clashed, spears struck against iron, and the ground trembled beneath the weight of legions ready to decide the fate of Rome. Across the field, two armies faced each other, one vast, glittering, confident, the other smaller, weathered and silent. Pompey's banners rippled in the wind, their crimson and gold glinting under the pale Sunday. His ranks stretched endlessly across the plain, row after row of polished armor gleaming like the scales of a serpent. The Senate stood behind him, watching from their hill, certain they would witness the fall of a tyrant. On the opposite side, Caesar's men stood shoulder to shoulder, scarred veterans of Gaul, their armor dull from years of war, their faces calm, their eyes steady. They did not need to be told what was at stake. They had followed Caesar through snow, through hunger, through fear itself. Now they would follow him through hell. Caesar rode along the line, his red cloak billowing in the wind. He stopped at the center, raising his sword. "Soldiers of Rome," he called out, his voice carrying across the plain. "You face men you once called brothers. They fight for pride. You fight for Rome. Remember that and hold the line." A cheer rose, not loud but deep, the kind that came from the soul. On Pompey's side, the air crackled with confidence. His officers urged him to strike first, to crush Caesar before his smaller army could maneuver. But Pompey shook his head. "No," he said. "Let them come to us. We will break their charge, then sweep them away." It was a plan, born of caution and pride. Caesar, watching from afar, read Pompey's hesitation like a book. He smiled faintly. "He waits for me," he murmured to his aides. "Good. Let him wait." Then he issued an order that would become legend. On his right flank, he hid a small reserve, 6 cohorts, hand-picked veterans, their shields darkened with mud to blend with the earth. Their task to strike at Pompey's cavalry when the time came. The drums thundered. Pompey's archers loosed their first volley, darkening the sky. Caesar's men raised their shields, arrows rattling harmlessly off the testudo formation. Then, with a roar that split the air, Caesar's legions surged forward. The two armies met like storms colliding. The clash of iron drowned out every other sound. Dust rose in choking clouds. The sun vanished behind it. Men shouted, fell rose again. The smell of sweat and iron and blood filled the air. Trumpets blared, banners tore, and for a moment it seemed the gods themselves were at war. Pompey's cavalry, his pride and power, charged Caesar's right wing. Their horses thundered across the plain, spears glinting. For a heartbeat, Caesar's flank wavered. Then came his hidden cohorts. With perfect timing, they surged from behind the dust clouds, striking the cavalry's flank with short swords drawn. The horsemen reeled, confused, their formation breaking like glass. Caesar's soldiers drove forward relentlessly, cutting down man and beast alike. From his command post, Pompey watched in disbelief. His line, his perfect, beautiful line, was collapsing. A messenger rushed to him. "General, our right wing is falling." Pompey stared blankly at the horizon. "Impossible," he whispered. But the impossible was already unfolding before his eyes. The tide turned swiftly, one flank breaking then the center. Caesar's men, sensing victory, pressed harder. The battlefield became chaos, a storm of blades and screams. Caesar himself rode to the front, shouting, "Forward, Rome is watching." His sword flashed in the dust, and blood, his voice unshaken, even as men fell around him. The discipline of his legions, honed through years of hardship, crushed the grandeur of Pompey's numbers. Pompey felt his heart sink. Around him, senators fled, standards fell. The sound of retreat echoed like thunder, fading into distance. He dismounted slowly, his armor covered in dust, his face pale. He looked once more across the field, the smoke rising, the cries of dying men, and whispered, "So this is how the Republic ends." As the sun dipped low, the plains of Pharsalus were stained red. The wind carried the scent of ashes and sorrow. Caesar dismounted, walking among the fallen. He did not cheer. He did not smile. He looked toward the horizon where Pompey had fled and said softly, "The greater the victory, the greater the loss." The battlefield grew silent, save for the distant caw of crows circling above. Shields lay shattered. Swords lay still. The dust began to settle, covering the dead like a final shroud. And in that silence, beneath the fading light of a dying day, the Republic breathed its last. The smoke of Pharsalus had barely cleared when Caesar began the pursuit. Pompey, once the great, once the pride of Rome, fled across the sea with only a handful of followers. The wind howled over the waves as his ship cut through the dark waters of the Mediterranean, carrying not a conqueror but a man haunted by ghosts. In his heart, Pompey still believed there might be mercy. He sailed for Egypt, a kingdom that owed him favors, a land he had once protected, but in Alexandria, mercy was a currency too costly to afford. The young pharaoh, fearful of offending Caesar, made a choice that would stain his throne forever. As Pompey's small boat reached the shore, soldiers greeted him with false smiles. He stepped onto the sand, weary but dignified, adjusting his tattered cloak. The sun burned high, casting long shadows across the water. One of the soldiers approached him, offering a hand, then drew a blade. There was no time for words, no final speech, no farewell to the world he once ruled. Pompey fell silently, his blood seeping into the sands of a foreign shore. When Caesar arrived days later, the Alexandrians brought him a gift, a wooden box. Inside lay the head of Pompey the Great. The tent fell silent. The officers who had followed Caesar for years stood frozen, watching their commander's face. He looked down at the lifeless eyes of the man who had once been his ally, his rival, his brother in glory. The candlelight flickered, and Caesar whispered, barely audible, he was a Roman. Then turning away, he covered his face, not in triumph, but in sorrow. That night, Caesar walked alone along the Nile. The river reflected the moonlight, smooth and endless like time itself. He had won every battle. The Senate had fallen, the armies of Rome now bowed to him. Yet in the quiet of the Egyptian night, victory felt like ash in his mouth. He had conquered the world, but lost the only man who could have understood the cost. He had won the war, but lost his friend and the soul of the Republic. The years that followed reshaped Rome forever. Caesar returned home, not as a general, but as a ruler. The people cheered his name as if he were a god. Statues were raised in his honor, his face stamped upon coins. The Senate, what remained of it, bestowed upon him powers no man before had ever held, dictator for life. And so, with the stroke of a pen and the silence of his peers, the Republic became an empire. Rome grew vast, rich, and powerful beyond imagination. Roads stretched across continents, armies marched beneath eagles of gold, and the world bowed to the might of its new order. But beneath the marble and the glory, something had been lost, something no victory could ever restore. The spirit of the Republic, once fierce and free, had faded into memory. Those who remembered Pompey spoke of him not as a saint or a villain, but as a man who believed too deeply in old ideals. Those who remembered Caesar spoke of him with awe and with fear. In the streets, some whispered that perhaps this was how it was always meant to be, that freedom was too fragile to survive the weight of human ambition. Years later, as history turned its wheel, the names changed, the battles changed, but the story remained the same. Power rises, power consumes. And freedom, if left unguarded, slowly dies. If you stood on the plains of Pharsalus today, you would see nothing but quiet fields and the whisper of the wind. No monuments, no armies, no echoes of steel. But if you listen closely, you might still hear it. The faint cry of men fighting, not for victory, but for the idea of Rome itself. The ghosts of two legends bound forever in history still face each other in that eternal silence. And as the sun sets over that ancient land, the voice of the narrator fades heavy with truth. In the echoes of that ancient battle, we still hear the warning that even the greatest republic can fall, not by enemies from without, but by ambition within.